There is a country where the average citizen holds more wealth than almost anyone alive in most of the world, yet drives an ordinary car, shops at an ordinary store, and lives in a house that does not announce what it contains. No gate separates one neighborhood from another. No visible luxury marks one family as different from the next. A janitor and a petroleum engineer stand at the same bus stop in the same weather and carry similar bags. The wealth is real. The restraint is equally real. Both exist simultaneously, and neither is accidental. This country controls one of the largest sovereign wealth funds ever assembled by a single nation. It holds stakes in thousands of corporations across more than 70 countries. It owns a portion of some of the most recognizable brands on the planet, purchased not through conquest or advantage, but through the patient accumulation of oil revenues redirected into a mechanism designed to outlast the oil itself. At current valuations, that fund exceeds the combined gross domestic product of most nations in the world. Every citizen is, in a technical sense, a stakeholder in an extraordinary inheritance. And yet the law, both written and unwritten, discourages any display of it. The question that follows is not simple. Why would a society possessing that level of wealth choose to live the way Norway lives? Why would a nation with every resource available to build visible monuments to its own prosperity choose, instead, to build functional infrastructure, fund public services, and resist the temptation of spectacle almost entirely? The answer does not arrive through politics or ideology alone. It arrives through something older, through geography, through memory, through a very particular relationship between people and the landscape they grew out of. Norway occupies the western edge of the Scandinavian peninsula, pressing hard against the North Atlantic on one side and sharing long borders with Sweden, Finland, and a narrow stretch touching Russia on the other. The land mass is considerable, but much of it is uninhabitable. Mountains cover more than half the country. Fjords cut deep channels into the coastline, isolating communities from each other for centuries before modern transport arrived. Forests cover large sections of the interior, and above a certain latitude, winter reduces daylight to a few hours a day for months at a stretch. This is not a geography that invites comfort. It is a geography that demands negotiation. People who have lived inside that negotiation for generations develop different instincts than people who have lived in abundance. Waste becomes something morally uncomfortable, not simply inefficient. Ostentation becomes something socially suspicious, not simply unusual. Cooperation becomes necessary because the land makes individual self-sufficiency almost impossible across much of its territory. These are not attitudes arrived at through policy documents. They are attitudes formed by centuries of difficult winters, uncertain harvests, and coastlines that gave as much as they took. Modern wealth arrived on top of those instincts, not beneath them. The instincts survived. The petroleum story begins quietly. In 1969, a large deposit of oil was discovered beneath the North Sea. The find was significant. Norway was, at that moment, a modest country. Its economy depended largely on fishing, shipping, and forestry. It had no framework prepared for the kind of wealth that was now technically within reach. What followed was a decision that would define the next half-century and remains, by most measurements, without parallel in the world. Instead of distributing oil revenues directly, Norway created a system that redirected them outward and forward. The government pension fund global, commonly called the Oil Fund, was built to hold those revenues and invest them internationally. The logic was deliberate. Flooding the domestic economy with oil money would inflate prices, distort labor markets, and create dependence on a resource that would eventually run out. By investing abroad and drawing down the funds slowly through a fiscal rule that limited annual withdrawals, Norway separated itself from the cycle of extraction and collapse that had damaged so many other oil-producing nations. The wealth was real, but its presence in daily life was filtered carefully. That filtering is visible in ways that are easy to miss unless you know what you are looking at. Norwegian infrastructure is reliable, not spectacular. Roads are maintained. Public transit functions. Healthcare absorbs cost before it reaches individuals. Education is funded at levels that remove financial anxiety from the decision to study. These are not glamorous expenditures. They do not photograph well. They do not generate headlines. But their cumulative effect is a population that moves through daily life without a set of anxieties that in many other wealthy countries remain fully present regardless of income level. This absence of anxiety is often what people mean when they describe Norway as happy. It is not that Norwegian life is joyful in a visible or expressive sense. The culture does not encourage that kind of display either. What it is stable. The knowledge that a medical emergency will not destroy a family's finances. The knowledge that losing a job triggers a system designed to hold a person rather than drop them. The knowledge that the quality of a child's education does not depend entirely on the postal code of the house they were born into. These things accumulate into something that functions like confidence, quiet and structural rather than emotional. Trust is part of it. Institutions in Norway are trusted not because the population has been convinced to trust them, but because they have, over time and with frequent exceptions and adjustments, performed in ways that justify trust. Government agencies process claims without demanding proof of suffering. Strangers leave bicycles unlocked. People pay taxes without widespread resentment because they can trace what those taxes become. The relationship between the citizen and the state is not adversarial in the way it is in many countries. It is closer to a contract, imperfect but legible. None of this was inevitable. Norway made choices. It had leaders who understood the difference between resource extraction and resource stewardship. It had a population that held cultural values old enough to predate the wealth and durable enough to shape how that wealth was handled. It had geography that made certain kinds of excess impractical and certain kinds of cooperation unavoidable. These factors do not guarantee good outcomes. They created the conditions under which good outcomes became more likely than they might have been elsewhere. What they produced is a country that is, by most external measurements, among the most successful societies in human history, yet one that would not describe itself that way. The Norwegian cultural disposition toward self-inflation is almost the reverse of pride. Success is acknowledged quietly, and suspicion is directed at anyone who announces it too loudly. The social concept of Jant's Law, though originally articulated in Danish fiction, captured something real about Scandinavian culture. The idea that you should not consider yourself better than others. That individual elevation above the collective is a sign of poor character rather than achievement. The oil fund exists. The standard of living exists. The ranking exists. But no one stands on a corner and announces it. The penguins know something about this. At Edinburgh Zoo in Scotland, a king penguin has held an honorary rank in the Norwegian Royal Guard for decades. The title is not ceremonial in the way that purely symbolic honors usually are. It is processed through actual military protocol. The penguin receives formal inspection. It is promoted. Its rank is recognized by the institution. When one penguin holding the title dies, the name and commission passed to the next. This has continued for generations. To someone outside the cultural framework, the story sounds like absurdist humor. Within Norway's relationship with formality, with nature, and with the quiet subversion of pomposity, it makes a different kind of sense. The most powerful institutions can carry their weight with lightness. Rank does not require gravity to be real. A penguin can hold a commission, and the commission still means something. The country is worth entering now. Not through the most obvious points, not through an airport gate or a tourist office, but through the logic of its oldest city, the one that reveals its character most clearly in the way it chooses to place things next to each other. Oslo does not announce itself the way that capital cities typically announce themselves. There is no grand approach, no overwhelming boulevard designed to project national confidence through scale. The city arrives gradually, through forested hillsides and fjord water, through streets that widen modestly and then narrow again, through buildings that perform their functions without asking to be admired for performing them. The first impression is of restraint so consistent that it begins to feel like a decision. At the harbor, the medieval fortress of Akershus holds the water's edge. It was built in the late 13th century when the kingdom that would eventually become Norway was small, peripheral, and acutely aware of its own vulnerability. The stone used was local, heavy, and chosen for endurance rather than appearance. Walls were built thick because thickness offered protection, not because thickness communicated power. The result is a structure that has survived fires, sieges, occupations, and the full trajectory of Norwegian history, without requiring the kind of restoration that turns historical sites into approximations of themselves. The original intention was survival. The structure survived. There is a directness in that outcome that feels characteristic. From the fortress ramparts, the modern city is visible across the water. One building holds the eye. The Oslo Opera House rises from the fjord with a surface of white granite and glass that slopes continuously into the water. There are no steps leading up to a formal entrance. No elevated position separates the building from the people who approach it. The roof is the plaza. Visitors walk across it. They sit on it. They watch the harbor from it. The architecture does not restrict access to demonstrate importance. It embeds importance in the act of access itself. These two structures, one medieval and one contemporary, face each other across the same harbor and do not contradict each other. They are in conversation. The fortress says, "We survived by building what we needed to build without excess, without decoration, because the conditions demanded it." The Opera House says, "We invest in culture the way we invest in roads, not because we want to impress, but because it belongs to everyone." The city holds both without irony or explanation. The rhythm of Oslo confirms this. Streets function first. Public spaces are designed for use before they are designed for photographs. Parks are active. Transit systems are clean without being theatrical about their cleanliness. The architecture of wealth here is not visible in private spaces. It is visible in public ones. Museums are excellent. Libraries are open late. The infrastructure for daily life performs with a consistency that registers as something other than luxury precisely, because it is distributed without condition. This is the city's argument, made not in language but in form. Wealth belongs to everyone or it belongs to no one. The Opera House can be walked across because it was paid for by everyone. The fjord is accessible because access to it was protected. The fortress is a free destination because history is not something you sell. These are choices. They are also, after a certain point, too deeply embedded in how the city operates to feel like choices anymore. They feel like the only logical way to do things. The logic holds as you move away from the city. Norway's interior is where the older arguments live. There are buildings still standing in Norway that were constructed before most of the world's current nations existed as concepts. They were not built to last. They were built to function. The fact that they lasted is a consequence of how seriously function was taken. When a material was chosen, it was chosen because it understood the climate it would inhabit. When a joint was cut, it was cut to allow movement rather than resist it. When a roof was shaped, it was shaped to shed the specific kind of precipitation that fell in that specific valley. Permanence was not the goal. Permanence arrived anyway, as a byproduct of precision. The stave churches of Norway represent this logic at its clearest. Bergen stave church, constructed in the late 12th century, stands in a valley in western Norway as one of the oldest and best preserved wooden structures in the world. It was assembled almost entirely without metal fasteners. The carpenters who built it understood wood the way a doctor understands a body. Not as a static material to be fixed in place, but as a living substance that would respond to temperature, absorb moisture, expand in summer, contract in winter, and move with the forces acting on it across seasons and centuries. Every joint was designed to accommodate that movement. Every connection allowed the building to breathe without losing its shape. The timber came from pine trees grown in slow forests. Short growing seasons and long winters compressed the annual rings of those trees until the wood they produced was denser and more resistant to decay than timber grown in warmer climates. The material was selected with the understanding that density translated directly into durability. Tar was applied to exterior surfaces, darkening the walls to near black and sealing them against moisture that would otherwise enter the grain and begin the process of deterioration from within. The building was not preserved against time. It was built with time already accounted for. Along the roof lines, carved dragon heads extend outward from the structure. Their origin is unmistakably pre-Christian. Norse mythology carried a complete cosmology in which natural forces were personified and needed to be acknowledged, addressed, and sometimes appeased. The church was a Christian structure built at a moment when Christianity had arrived in Norway, but had not yet displaced everything that preceded it. The builders did not resolve this tension by choosing one tradition and erasing the other. They placed both in the same building. The dragon head stood watch over a space where Christian rites were performed. Nobody found this contradictory because it was not, in practice, contradictory. It was adaptive. Inside, the proportions change everything. Thick walls and narrow openings reduce light to something deliberate and sparse. The interior does not feel like a cathedral designed to overwhelm the senses with height and light and the sensation of standing before something much larger than yourself. It feels closer to a forest interior, dense, quiet, held. The act of worship in this space was not meant to feel extraordinary. It was meant to feel like the environment already felt. The silence of trees, the filtered light of a thick canopy. The sense that the space around you was older than your arrival in it and would persist after your departure. Bergen does not ask to be treated as a relic. It functions as evidence. Evidence that the people who built it understood their materials, their climate, their beliefs, and their limitations with equal seriousness. They did not build beyond what the knowledge available to them could support. They did not pursue ambition at the expense of integrity. The building still stands because they did not. That logic runs through Norwegian culture at a frequency too consistent to be coincidence. Moving west from the interior valleys, the landscape begins a process of compression and then sudden release. The terrain rises, then drops, then opens toward water. This is where the fjords begin their argument with the imagination. The western coast of Norway is one of the most geologically dramatic environments on the surface of the planet. Yet it does not present itself as dramatic in the way that phrase is usually understood. There is no explosion of color, no tropical excess. The palette is restrained to gray rock, dark water, green slope, and the white of persistent snow at elevation. What creates the sensation of drama is scale, and scale here operates differently than it does in most places, because it is always in relationship to a human figure that cannot expand to meet it. At Hellerin Farm, this relationship between human presence and geological scale arrives in miniature. Two small wooden structures sit beneath a massive rock overhang on a coastal slope. The placement looks, at first glance, like it might be accidental. A closer reading reveals that it was entirely intentional. The families who built and lived here had almost no resources to work with. The land offered nothing level and very little that was fertile. What it offered was a ceiling. The rock above the site deflects rain, reduces wind, and creates a zone of relative stability within a landscape that offers very little of it. The farmers did not fight the terrain. They read it carefully and placed themselves where it was already solving their problem. The houses stayed small. Anything larger would have extended beyond the shelter of the overhang and into exposure. Anything larger would have required more material, more heat, more maintenance. The scale of the houses was not a failure of ambition. It was the result of a precise calculation about what the environment would support and what it would not. That precision is the same precision visible in the stave church's joinery, the same precision visible in the oil fund's fiscal rule. The form changes. The underlying logic does not. Beyond Hellerin, the terrain rises sharply. The shelter disappears. What replaces it is one of the most visited geological formations in Scandinavia, though the word visited does not quite capture what the experience of approaching it involves. Preikestolen is a plateau of rock roughly 25 square meters in area, positioned at the top of a sheer cliff, face approximately 600 meters above the water of Fjords. The formation was not shaped by human activity. A glacier created it. As ice accumulated in the valley below and then retreated, fractures formed along existing geological boundaries in the cliff face. The flat horizontal surface that remained was the result of cleavage along those fractures, a process driven by the physics of freeze and thaw operating across thousands of years, without any particular intention toward the result. The plateau is flat not because flatness was designed, but because flatness is what that specific combination of geological forces produced when acting on that specific type of rock. Reaching it requires between 2 and 4 hours of walking, depending on pace and conditions. The trail is not gentle. It climbs consistently, crosses wet rock, demands attention to footing, and offers no moment of anticipated arrival. The plateau does not become visible until you are essentially standing on it. There is no viewpoint from which you can see it approaching. The path simply continues until it stops, and when it stops, there is no more mountain above you and no surface below you for 600 meters. Standing at the edge does not produce the experience most people expect before they stand there. It is not thrilling in the way that word is typically applied. The scale removes thrill as a useful category. What replaces it is something more like precision. The edge is exact. The distance to the water is exact. Your weight on the surface feels measurable. Your position in the space is legible in a way that most positions in most spaces are not. You know exactly where you are, exactly where the edge is, and exactly what the consequence of misreading either of those facts would be. This is not fear. It is a form of clarity. The rock does not respond to presence. It holds the same position whether one person stands there or 1,000. It was holding that position before the first human climbed to it and will hold it after the last one descends. There is no transaction here, no exchange. The plateau exists entirely on its own terms, and the experience of standing on it is the experience of encountering something that has no interest in the encounter at all. That quality, the complete indifference of the stone, is what makes the place feel significant. Significance in the Norwegian landscape rarely announces itself. It simply remains. The fjord below the plateau is Fjords, and the road system that enters it from the mountains above is one of the most technically specific pieces of infrastructure in Europe. Bergen is a mountain road that descends to the fjord through 27 hairpin turns carved directly into near-vertical rock faces. The road was built not to be driven quickly, but to be driven at all. The terrain offered no natural path. Every meter of the route was created by removing stone that was in the way. The curves are tight enough that large vehicles cannot navigate them without multiple point turns. The gradient is steep enough that brakes perform differently than they do on ordinary roads. The views that appear between turns are not framed or planned. They appear because the turns expose them, and then immediately replace them with the next section of cliff face. What Bergen does to behavior is what most Norwegian landscapes do to behavior. It slows people down without instruction. Drivers reduce speed not because signs tell them to, though signs do tell them to, but because the road itself communicates through its geometry what the appropriate pace is. Attention shifts. Peripheral awareness increases. The sensation of height arrives through the body rather than through the eyes alone. This is the environment performing a function that no signage could replicate. The road teaches the driver how to drive it through the act of driving it. At the upper valley, Bolton introduces a different scale of the same logic. A large boulder is wedged between two cliff faces above a drop of nearly 1,000 meters. The stone is held in position by pressure alone. There are no mechanical fasteners, no geological cement, no structure underneath it providing support. Two opposing rock faces are pressing against it from either side, and that pressure is sufficient to hold it suspended above a void that has no floor visible from the boulder's surface. The formation exists because the physics of compression are adequate. It is not stable in the sense that it will never move. It is stable in the sense that the forces holding it currently exceed the forces that would release it. At some point in the future, those forces will reverse. The boulder will move. Until then, it holds. People climb to it and step onto its surface for photographs. The act of standing on the boulder is not as dangerous as it appears from a distance, since the platform it creates is wide enough to stand on without difficulty. But the context of the act, standing on a free suspended stone above a 1,000-meter void, held by physics rather than by engineering, is one of the clearest possible illustrations of what the Norwegian landscape does repeatedly. It puts you in a position where the margin between safety and consequence is defined by forces you did not create and cannot modify. You can be careful or careless. The forces do not change in response to which you choose. South and west from Fjords, the landscape enters a different register. The terrain softens slightly. Water becomes less vertical and more horizontal. The quality of light changes, and in certain seasons, The character of what grows along the lower slopes begins to suggest that the land is capable of something beyond mere endurance. Fjord is the second longest fjord in Norway, and one of the few places in the country where the combination of geographical factors creates conditions suitable for large-scale agriculture. The fjord runs deep into the interior, and its shores receive the full benefit of warm Atlantic air moving inland along its water surface. Glaciers in the mountains above contribute steady meltwater that carries mineral content from ancient rock down into the soil of the lower slopes. The result is a valley where temperature, moisture, and soil composition intersect in a way that makes the cultivation of fruit trees not merely possible, but genuinely productive. Apple orchards line the lower slopes of Fjord in rows that follow the natural contours of the terrain, rather than imposing a grid upon it. The trees are planted where the soil allows them to be planted, at the elevation where frost does not arrive too early and where moisture is consistent enough to support them through dry stretches. In spring, they bloom while snow remains visible on the ridges above. The timing is exact. The blossoms and the snowfield occupy the same frame, separated by a vertical distance of a few hundred meters and a temperature difference of several degrees. This is not a contradiction of seasons. It is a consequence of the fjord's geometry, which creates a microclimate in its lower reaches that operates independently of the conditions higher up. The farmers here have worked within this system for centuries. They understand it in the way that long familiarity produces understanding, not as a set of rules to be applied, but as a set of tendencies to be read. A late cold spell requires a specific response. An early melt requires a different one. The orchards are productive, but they are productive within margins. Step outside those margins, and the system withdraws its cooperation without warning. The fruit arrives because the farmer did not push the land beyond what it was willing to give. That negotiation is the same one conducted across almost every productive human relationship with Norwegian geography. Inland from the orchards, the terrain rises again and water accelerates. What was a broad, patient fjord becomes a confined channel, and then a vertical drop. Voringsfossen collects meltwater from the Hardangervidda Plateau, the largest high mountain plateau in northern Europe, and releases it through a single opening at the plateau's edge. The drop is approximately 180 meters. The flow changes with season swollen in spring by snowmelt and reduced by late summer. But the channel that carries it is fixed cut deep into hard rock over periods of time that make the concept of a river cutting through stone feel less like a metaphor and more like a description of a very slow and completely effective process. A footbridge crosses the gorge near the base of the falls. The structure is minimal. It was designed to withstand the spray, vibration, and wind load created by the waterfall operating at maximum flow without interrupting the waterfall's path in any visible way. The bridge does not frame the falls. It does not position itself as the feature. It is infrastructure in the truest sense, a thing that allows people to occupy a position that would otherwise be unavailable to them, without making the occupation of that position about the infrastructure itself. This is what good Norwegian engineering tends to look like. It solves the problem without announcing that it solved the problem. The solution is invisible unless you are looking for it, and even then it is visible only as the absence of a problem that might otherwise have been present. Bergen arrives the way most things in Norway arrive, without ceremony. The city does not present itself as a destination so much as a fact. It is here because it had to be here, Positioned at the point where fjords and coastline and the demands of Atlantic trade converged into something that required a settlement to manage them. The harbor was not chosen for beauty. It was chosen because it worked. Every subsequent decision about how to build the city, where to place things, what materials to use, what to repair and what to replace, follows from that original pragmatic logic. The rain is part of Bergen's character in a way that is difficult to overstate. The city receives more precipitation than almost any other city in Europe. Water arrives not in dramatic storms that announce themselves and then depart, but in long, persistent cycles that darken surfaces and saturate materials and create a baseline condition in which everything either adapts or deteriorates. The wooden buildings along the harbor adapted. They darkened. They were repainted. They burned repeatedly, were rebuilt along the same footprint and darkened again. The process repeated itself often enough that it became less a series of disasters and more a rhythm of renewal. The city learned to rebuild quickly not because rebuilding was efficient, but because stopping was not an option. Bergen stands at the center of this history. A row of narrow wooden warehouse buildings facing the harbor water, their facades painted in the ochres and reds and yellows that became the city's most recognizable feature. The colors were not decorative in origin. They identified ownership. In a harbor where dozens of merchant operations stored goods in adjacent structures, and where fog and low light made visual distinction difficult, color served the function of a label. This warehouse belongs to this merchant. These contents are managed by this organization. The palette was practical before it was beautiful, and it became beautiful through the accumulation of practical decisions repeated over centuries. The warehouses were built during the period when the Hanseatic League controlled much of the trade moving through northern European ports. Dried fish, primarily cod and herring, moved through these buildings in quantities that were sufficient to sustain populations across Europe during periods when other protein sources were unreliable. The fish came from Norwegian waters where cold temperatures and specific current patterns created conditions in which cod gathered in extraordinary concentrations at predictable times of year. They were caught, processed, dried, and stored. The storage buildings of Bergen were not the beginning of that supply chain and not the end of it. They were the point of concentration, where the work of fishermen across a vast coastline passed through a single bottleneck before being redistributed across a continent. The buildings leaned slightly now, the consequence of settling on reclaimed ground that was never entirely stable. The lean is not structural failure. It is geological time expressing itself through architecture. The ground moved gradually over centuries and the buildings moved with it. Timber frames that were designed to accommodate movement accommodated this movement too. The adaptability built into the joinery to manage seasonal expansion and contraction also managed, incidentally, the slow drift of soft ground. The buildings are crooked, but they are not broken. There is a distinction between those two conditions that Norwegian construction tends to understand very well. From Bergen, the coastal logic of Norway continues northward, and the fjords tighten. Fjord is among the narrowest fjords in the world. At its most compressed section, the walls of rock on either side come to within approximately 250 meters of each other. Above, those walls rise more than 500 meters in near vertical faces, with very little transition between the cliff surface and the water surface below it. There is almost no shore. There is rock, then water, and the distinction between them is sharp. The formation is the result of a specific glacial condition. During the last ice age, the glacier that occupied this valley encountered bedrock of unusual hardness. In most fjords, glacial movement widens the valley as the ice grinds against the walls on either side. Here, the hardness of the rock resisted lateral erosion more effectively than the ice could overcome. The glacier was forced to deepen rather than widen, cutting a narrow, deep trench that preserved its compressed proportions when the ice retreated and seawater filled the space it had vacated. The result is a fjord that behaves differently from most. Sound travels strangely in it. Light enters at steep angles that change quickly as the sun moves. Reflections of the cliff faces on the water surface appear so complete that the boundary between stone and its reflection becomes genuinely ambiguous. Waterfalls descend from above in thin, separate lines, each fed by seasonal snowmelt from sources not visible from the fjord floor. They appear at irregular intervals along the walls, emerging from fractures in the rock and dropping straight down without the spreading or dispersal that waterfalls in more open terrain develop. The confined geometry keeps them vertical and distinct. They are not decorative. They are meltwater performing its function, which is to find the lowest point available to it through whatever path the rock permits. The path happens to be spectacular. The water is indifferent to this. The silence of NORWAY Fjord is a physical quality. The enclosing rock absorbs sound from wind and water at the same time that it blocks the ambient noise of the surrounding landscape. A boat moving through the fjord produces a sound that seems disproportionately large in relation to its source, and then disappears immediately when the engine stops. Voices carry without effort across the water. The quiet that follows any sound is not gradual. It is immediate and total. This quality of silence is one of the most specific sensory experiences Norway's geography produces, and one of the least translatable into language. What emerges from this place, and from the hours required to pass through it, is not wonder in any excited sense. It is something closer to recalibration. The scale of what surrounds you adjusts the scale at which you experience everything inside yourself. Problems that arrived at the beginning of the day feel differently proportioned by the time the fjord opens again. This is not therapy. It is geometry. The geometry of enclosure and release, of scale and miniaturization, doing what it has always done to every creature that moves through it. Infrastructure follows the same landscape that shaped the fjords, and sometimes it goes through them entirely. The Flam Railway was built to solve a problem that the landscape created by existing. Between the town of Flam at sea level and the national rail network at Mjødal, the elevation difference is approximately 860 meters. The distance between those 2 points, as a bird would travel, is manageable. As an engineer would travel through terrain that rises steeply and without consistent grade, it presented a challenge that had no simple solution. The railway was the solution that was eventually chosen, but choosing it and building it were different problems. Construction began in the early 20th century using methods available before modern tunneling equipment existed. Crews advanced through rock by drilling holes by hand, filling them with explosives, detonating them, and then removing the resulting debris before beginning again. Progress was measured in meters per day. Tunnels were cut through solid mountain, not because tunnels were preferred, but because the alternative was a route that the grade would make impassable in winter. 20 separate tunnels passed through the mountainside along the completed line, several of them incorporating complete spiral turns inside the rock to gain elevation, without exceeding the gradient limits of the track. The railway was built to move goods and people. It accomplished this efficiently once completed. What it revealed, as a secondary consequence, was that the route it followed passed through terrain of such concentrated geological variety, such compressed sequences of valley and cliff and waterfall and open fjord, that the journey itself became a thing separate from the destination. Passengers who boarded the train to travel between two functional points found themselves moving through a landscape that the train's existence had made legible in a way it would not have been otherwise. The infrastructure created the experience as a byproduct of solving the logistical problem. This dynamic, in which solving a practical problem reveals something unexpected about the value of the solution, appears repeatedly in Norway. The country does not often build things for beauty. It builds things because problems require solutions. The beauty arrives anyway, as a consequence of precision applied to a landscape that was already extraordinary before anyone attempted to move through it at speed. Underground, the same logic operates at a different scale. The Lærdal Tunnel extends approximately 24 kilometers beneath the mountains of western Norway, making it the longest road tunnel currently in service anywhere in the world. Its existence addresses a problem similar to the one the Flam Railway addressed, which is that Norwegian geography repeatedly places important points of connection on opposite sides of obstacles that cannot be crossed on the surface for significant portions of the year. Mountain passes close with snow. Ferries are weather dependent. The tunnel removed those variables entirely. The road now connects Bergen to Oslo with no seasonal closure, no ferry crossing, no weather dependency. The mountain above the tunnel still exists and still closes the surface route for months each year. Below it, traffic moves continuously. The interior of the tunnel was designed with an understanding of human psychology that engineering documents rarely acknowledge explicitly, but that the designers clearly took seriously. A drive of 24 kilometers through uniform darkness produces a specific kind of disorientation. The absence of visual landmarks makes the estimation of distance and elapsed time unreliable. Focus diminishes. Fatigue arrives more quickly than it would on a surface road of equivalent length. The design response to this was the introduction of gradual color changes at intervals throughout the tunnel's length. Soft blue and yellow light marks transition zones inside the rock, breaking the drive into segments that the mind can process as separate stages rather than one continuous and featureless passage. The lighting does not create drama. It creates orientation. There is no spectacle inside the Lærdal Tunnel. There is a road that continues to function at the level required of it, carrying drivers through a mountain they cannot see, past the bedrock that was removed to create the space they occupy, and delivering them to daylight at the far end without incident. The absence of incident is the achievement. In Norway, absence of incident is usually what success looks like. North along the coast, the landscape opens and deepens simultaneously. Fjord receives more visitors per year than any other fjord in Norway, a fact that reveals something about what the human eye consistently responds to when the options are wide. The fjord is deep, the walls are high, and the waterfalls that descend along its length are among the most volumetrically significant in the country. The most widely recognized of them is known as the Seven Sisters. 7 separate streams descend side by side from snowfields above the southern wall of the fjord, each maintaining its own path down the cliff face without fully merging with its neighbors. The streams originate from the same general snowfield, but follow separate channels shaped by the specific topography of the cliff, arriving at the fjord at 7 distinct points spaced close enough together to be read as a unit, but far enough apart to remain individually legible. The flow is not constant. Spring snowmelt brings the falls to their maximum volume, when each stream is a substantial cascade visible from kilometers away. By late summer, they thin to threads, some disappearing entirely during dry years, resuming their full character only when snowfall returns in autumn. The cliff face that hosts them is unchanged by either condition. It received them and releases them with equal indifference. The rock does not remember the water that passes through it. The water takes no permanent impression from the rock, despite the fact that the channel exists because water carved it over time. The impermanence of the interaction is not a diminishment. It is the condition that makes the interaction possible. High on the slopes above the fjord, small wooden farm structures cling to narrow ledges cut into the cliff face. These farms were occupied within living memory, accessible only by ladder and steep footpath, maintained by families who kept livestock on the limited grass that grew at those elevations, and who understood that the decision to live there was a permanent negotiation with vertigo, weather, and isolation. The decision was practical. The lower ground belonged to the fjord. The middle slopes were too steep for cultivation. The high ledges offered the only soil that was level enough to support any agricultural use at all. The farms existed where farming was barely possible, not where farming was comfortable. They were eventually abandoned. The combination of physical difficulty and the availability of alternatives made continuation impractical for the generations who inherited the choice. The structures were not demolished. They remain in position on their ledges, visible from the fjord below as small evidence of what sustained human presence in extreme conditions once required. The waterfalls continue to run past them. The cliff holds them in place without effort or intention. The abandonment is not a failure. It is an honest acknowledgement that certain arrangements are temporary even when the structures that house them are built to last. Inland from Fjord, the terrain reorganizes itself around a road that has no equivalent in the infrastructure of most countries. Trollstigen climbs a mountain face through 11 sharp hairpin turns cut by hand into near-vertical rock at the beginning of the 20th century. The road was not surveyed from above, and then engineered into a slope that was adjusted to receive it. The slope was examined closely, and the road was placed where the slope permitted, which was in several cases barely. The turns are tight enough that the road narrows at each bend to the minimum width that allows traffic to pass. Guard rails exist, but they are minimal, positioned to mark the edge rather than to create a barrier that implies safety independent of the driver's attention. Waterfalls cross the road at multiple points. This was not a miscalculation. The route was planned knowing where the water came from and where it went, and the decision was made to cross it rather than avoid it, because avoidance would have required a significantly longer and more technically complex route. The road passes through the waterfall's path. Culverts direct the flow beneath the pavement. During snowmelt, water still spreads across the surface in thin sheets. The pavement is wet. It has always been wet at these points and was designed with that knowledge applied to the surface material and the drainage system. The road closes each year when ice and rockfall make it impassable. It opens when conditions allow it to open. The schedule is not fixed. The mountain determines it. This is not unusual in Norway's relationship with its own infrastructure. The infrastructure was built into an environment that has always reserved the right to withdraw cooperation. The engineers understood this when they built it. The maintenance crews understand it when they work on it. The drivers understand it when they approach it. Everyone involved in the system's operation has accepted the same basic condition, which is that the road exists on terms set by the landscape, rather than terms set by the road. Ålesund stands below Trollstigen on islands facing open water, and it arrived at its current form through an event that destroyed everything that preceded it. In January of 1904, a fire moved through the city of Ålesund during winter darkness and burned nearly all of its wooden buildings to the ground. 10,000 people lost their homes in a single night. The event was catastrophic. The response was immediate and, in retrospect, decisive. Reconstruction began almost before the debris was cold. The decision was made not to rebuild what had existed, but to build what the moment allowed, which was a new city in stone, designed in the Art Nouveau style that was prominent in European architecture at the turn of the century. Within 3 years, Ålesund was rebuilt almost entirely. The new buildings were constructed close together on the same constrained island geography that had shaped the original settlement. Curved facades and ornamental details replaced the plain timber fronts of the previous streetscape. Stone replaced wood as the primary material, eliminating the vulnerability to fire that had made the original city's destruction possible. The harbor continued to function throughout the reconstruction period. Fishing boats went out. Processing continued. The economy did not wait for the city to be finished before resuming operations, because resumption of operations was partly what the reconstruction was for. The rebuilt Ålesund is unusually coherent architecturally for a city of its size. Because reconstruction happened in a concentrated period within a single stylistic moment, the buildings share a vocabulary that most cities accumulate only through accident or strict regulatory control. Walking through, it produces the sensation of a city that was always this way, that the ornamental facades and the curved roof lines were always part of the landscape. They were not. They were a response to a disaster. The disaster left no visible trace in the result. The result absorbed it completely. This is another version of the Norwegian approach to misfortune, which is not to memorialize the damage, but to concentrate entirely on what comes next. What comes next, moving along the coast toward open water, is a structure that does not attempt to hide from what surrounds it. The Atlantic Road connects a series of small islands along a stretch of the Norwegian coast where the North Atlantic arrives without barrier. The road is approximately 8 kilometers long in total, laid at a height barely above the waterline rather than elevated above the sea. This was not a compromise born from limited engineering ambition. It was a deliberate alignment with the actual conditions of the site, which is that water moves freely across this stretch of coastline, and any structure that attempted to exclude it entirely would either fail under the force it was trying to resist or require a scale of construction that the purpose of the road could not justify. Storsøysundet Bridge is the most photographed section of the Atlantic Road. It curves sharply upward at its midpoint and then drops back toward the road's surface, creating a visual effect from certain angles and in certain weather conditions, in which the deck appears to end abruptly in open air. The effect is produced by curvature and perspective working together in a way that removes the far end of the bridge from the visible frame. The road continues beyond the apparent edge. It simply cannot be seen from that position. The bridge was engineered to flex. Wind and wave loads on a structure of this exposure, and this geometry are not uniform and not predictable. A bridge that resisted those forces rigidly would concentrate stress at its weakest points and eventually be destroyed by the same forces it was trying to withstand. A bridge that flexes distributes those forces across its length and dissipates them through movement rather than through resistance. The engineering is counterintuitive only if rigidity is the assumed standard. In Norway's coastal environment, rigidity is rarely the correct approach. The landscape has been demonstrating this for long enough that the engineers appear to have absorbed the lesson. During severe storms, waves break over the roadway. Spray clears the guard rails. Wind pushes water sideways across the deck surface. These events are not the result of design failure. They were anticipated during construction, and the structure was reinforced accordingly. The road closed for repairs several times while being built, sustained damage, and was completed in a form that reflected those experiences. The final design includes the consequences of having been damaged. It is more reliable because it was damaged than it would have been if construction had proceeded without interruption. The damage was information. The information was incorporated. This is how Norwegian infrastructure tends to behave over time. Traffic moves across the Atlantic Road when conditions permit and stops when they do not. The road does not attempt to be passable in all conditions. It attempts to be structurally sound in all conditions and passable in the conditions it was designed for. The distinction matters. Claiming all-weather reliability would require a structure so removed from the water that it would no longer be what it is. What it is a road that accepts the environment it occupies rather than claiming dominance over it. The sea moves beneath the spans. The spans hold their position. Both continue. North from the Atlantic coastline, the Lofoten Islands enter the frame in winter light, and the frame changes completely. The Lofoten archipelago extends into the Norwegian Sea above the Arctic Circle, a chain of steep, rocky islands with almost no flat ground and very little soil. The islands rise sharply from the water in dark, jagged profiles visible from far at sea, which is why they were navigated by fishermen for centuries before precise charts existed. They are landmarks before they are islands. Their visibility in all weather, in fog, in snow, in the long polar night, made them reference points for a coastline that would otherwise have been featureless and dangerous. The villages of Rieni and Hamna occupy small flat areas at the water's edge, where the terrain briefly allows for structures to stand level. Red wooden buildings cluster close to the water, painted in a color that was chosen not for aesthetics but for visibility. In fog and snow and the gray light of the Arctic winter, red is visible at distances where other colors become ambiguous. The buildings need to be seen because they are working structures, not residential retreats. Boats must be able to locate them. Workers must be able to move between them in conditions that reduce visibility to meters. The winter season brings Atlantic cod into these waters to spawn. The fish have been arriving here for as long as the islands have been inhabited, following the same currents along the same routes for reasons entirely independent of the human calendar built around their arrival. Fishermen have organized their lives to meet this migration for centuries. The cod is caught, processed immediately, and hung on large wooden racks to dry in the cold air and steady wind that the islands provide in abundance. No salt is added. No fuel is burned. The drying process depends entirely on temperature and airflow that the geography delivers as a matter of seasonal routine. The result is stockfish. Dried until its moisture content is reduced to a fraction of its original volume, the fish becomes lightweight, dense, and capable of being stored and transported over distances that fresh fish could never survive. Stockfish fed European populations through long winters and extended sea voyages. It connected these remote islands to markets in Portugal, Italy, and West Africa through trade routes that operated continuously for centuries before modern refrigeration made the product technically unnecessary. The trade still exists. The racks still fill with fish each winter. The method has not required updating because the method is already optimal for the conditions in which it operates. Optimality in Norwegian practice tends to persist. Farther east along the Lofoten coast, where space becomes even more constrained, the Henningsvær football pitch occupies a flat rock surface entirely surrounded by water. There are no stands. No barriers separate the playing surface from the sea on any side. Boats pass close by during matches. Play stops for weather because the weather that affects the playing surface is the same weather that affects everything else on these islands. And playing surface is not a separate category of environment that can be insulated from conditions. The pitch exists because flat ground was required, and this was the flat ground available. The geography did not offer an alternative, so the geography was accepted as the condition rather than treated as a problem to be solved. This acceptance runs through daily life in Lofoten with a consistency that visitors sometimes read as resignation and residents experience as practicality. The sea is present everywhere. It governs timing, weather, diet, movement, and the physical arrangement of buildings on land. There is no position in these villages from which the sea is not visible and audible. It is not background. It is context. Everything that happens here happens within it and because of it and in response to it. The fishing families who built this culture did not choose between the sea and a life on land. The sea was the land. The distinction does not apply here in the way it applies elsewhere. Above the Arctic Circle, as latitude increases and the light begins to behave in ways that have no equivalent at lower latitudes, a different quality of experience takes hold. Tromsø sits well above the Arctic Circle on an island in a fjord, surrounded by mountains that compress the available geography, while the sky above remains open to an extent that feels disproportionate to the confined terrain below. In winter, the sun does not rise above the horizon for weeks. Darkness is not the absence of day. It is a condition with its own character, its own light sources, its own rhythms of activity and rest. People who live here do not wait for the dark period to end. They inhabit it as fully as they inhabit the summer period when the sun does not set for an equivalent duration. The aurora borealis appears regularly above Tromsø during the dark months. The light begins as something that might be cloud, a faint luminescence at the horizon that could easily be dismissed as atmospheric scatter. It strengthens gradually, developing structure, and then begins to move. The motion is slow and continuous, bands of green and violet that shift across the sky without sound, without repetition, without a pattern that repeats on any human timescale. The process that produces it operates far above the visible atmosphere. Charged particles released by the solar wind interact with molecules in the upper layers of the atmosphere and release energy in the visible spectrum. The light is real. Its cause is not local. It arrives from the sun and is expressed by the planet's magnetic field and atmosphere working together at altitudes too high for weather to affect. Watching it does not produce the same response in everyone. Some people find it overwhelming. Some find it peaceful. What it consistently produces is a reorientation of scale. The sky becomes deep in a way that it does not feel during daylight, when its surface appears finite and bounded by weather. The aurora reveals depth that daylight conceals. The planet's atmosphere is a thin shell over an enormous space, and the light moving through that shell is connected to events 93 million miles away that are themselves connected to processes operating across billions of years of stellar history. The scale that Preikestolen imposes downward and outward, The aurora imposes upward and inward. Both arrive without asking permission. Both leave the person who encounters them with a recalibrated sense of what the relevant unit of measurement is for the questions that matter. In the water below Tromsø, orca move through the fjord during the same winter months. Herring migrations bring large concentrations of fish into the coastal waters, and the orca follow them along routes determined by the fish rather than by geography. Their presence near shore is predictable within seasons, but not within days. They arrive when the herring are present and depart when the herring move. The coordination within pods during feeding is efficient and specific, individuals taking positions that optimize the group's collective ability to concentrate and capture fish. The behavior has been observed and documented for decades. It has not changed in any significant way during that time. The whales do not adjust their methods to observation. The observation adjusts itself to the whales. The two things happening simultaneously above and below Tromsø, the aurora shifting in silence and the orca working efficiently through dark water, are connected by nothing except the environment that contains them both. The Arctic in winter at this latitude is the kind of place where those two things can happen at the same time, and neither is unusual. Both are expressions of systems operating at scales beyond human design, producing effects that humans can witness but not replicate, and both continue whether witnessed or not. Further north, past the point where most of Norway's permanent settlement ends, the archipelago of Svalbard occupies a position in the Arctic Ocean that makes every human arrangement within it provisional in a way that even the most challenging mainland environments do not approach. Svalbard receives cargo and fuel and food by air and sea during windows of accessibility that weather determines. Permafrost covers the ground at depths that make conventional construction impossible. Buildings sit on pilings driven to depths where the frozen ground is stable, rather than on foundations that interact with soil the way foundations elsewhere interact with soil. The permafrost must remain frozen for the buildings above it to remain stable. If the permafrost thaws, the structural basis of every built thing on the archipelago begins to fail. This is not a theoretical concern. It is a present condition that informs every engineering decision made in Svalbard, and increasingly, as temperatures rise, it informs the anxiety that underlies those decisions. Polar bears outnumber the human population of Svalbard. This fact is not cited here for novelty. It is cited because it changes the practical arrangement of human life in ways that are invisible until you examine them carefully. Travel outside the settled areas requires a rifle and the knowledge and legal authorization to use it. The requirement is not bureaucratic caution. It is a response to an environment in which a predator capable of killing a human being moves across the same terrain that humans move across, and does so according to its own schedule and priorities, rather than by any awareness of or deference to human presence. The regulation of human movement by the possibility of bear encounter is one of the clearest expressions of a general condition in the Arctic, which is that human presence here is accommodated by the environment on terms that the environment reserves the right to revise. Buried in the permafrost near Longyearbyen, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault was built into a mountain at a depth, and in conditions chosen specifically, because they required minimal technological intervention to maintain. The location was selected for its permafrost stability and its geological isolation, far from any site likely to be affected by the kinds of events that the vault was designed to survive. The vault stores duplicate seeds from agricultural systems around the world. If a seed collection maintained in a national bank is destroyed by flood, fire, conflict, or institutional failure, the duplicate stored here provides a basis for recovery. The seeds are not unique. They are insurance policies expressed in biological material. The vault does not announce itself. Its entrance is a low, rectangular structure emerging from a hillside, practical and unadorned, positioned to be functional rather than to be visited. Access is restricted. The contents are not on display. Most of the time, the vault is simply there, holding in frozen quiet what it was built to hold, waiting for a withdrawal request that may never come, but that justifies its existence simply by remaining possible. It is, in a sense, the most Norwegian building in the world. It was built for a purpose so serious that it required no decoration. It will succeed most completely if it is never needed. Its value is entirely in what it prevents rather than what it produces. Burial is not permitted in Svalbard. The permanently frozen ground does not decompose organic matter in the way that soil at warmer latitudes does. Bodies buried here do not return to the earth in any meaningful time frame. The practical consequence is that people who reach the end of life in Svalbard are transported elsewhere for burial. This is a logistical policy, not a ceremonial one. It was determined by the ground conditions, not by any belief system about what the end of life requires. The ground cannot receive the dead. The dead are taken somewhere where the ground can. This adjustment, like so many adjustments in Norway, was made when conditions required it, and without any particular drama about what it implied. What Svalbard makes explicit that the rest of Norway implies is that human civilization here exists within constraints that were not set by humans and cannot be modified by human preference. The civilization is real. The infrastructure works. The community functions. But the margins are visible in a way that mainland prosperity tends to obscure. There is always a next step past which the system does not extend. In Svalbard, you can see that boundary from the window of most buildings. Norway's relationship with its own wealth is ultimately a story about what happens when a society that remembers those visible boundaries receives an extraordinary amount of money and has to decide what to do with it. The memory is not metaphorical. The Norwegians who made the key decisions about the oil fund were not distant from the culture that built stave churches in negotiation with weather, that placed farmhouses beneath rock overhangs, that carved roads into cliffs by hand, and built railways through mountains a few feet at a time. The values that shaped those decisions were formed by centuries of navigating a landscape that rewarded precision and punished excess, that made cooperation necessary and self-aggrandizement impractical, that taught restraint not as a virtue, but as a survival strategy. The wealth arrived, and the restraint remained. The fund grew, and the houses stayed ordinary. The rankings accumulated, and the public spaces remained public. The infrastructure was invested in because infrastructure is visible to everyone and luxury is visible to very few. And in a culture where Jant's law operates as a social force rather than merely a literary observation, the choice between public and private investment was not experienced as a sacrifice. It was experienced as obvious. This is what makes Norway's model difficult to replicate through policy alone. It is not simply a fund with a fiscal rule and an investment mandate. It is a set of values that developed over centuries in response to a specific geography and a specific history of scarcity that happened to be in place when abundance arrived. The fund is the mechanism. The values are the engine. You cannot borrow the mechanism without having developed the values that tell you what the mechanism is for. The penguin at Edinburgh Zoo, receiving its formal military inspection, is a Norwegian officer because someone decided that the formality of rank and the improbability of the recipient were not contradictions, but companions. That gravity does not require pomposity to be real. That something can be taken entirely seriously and held with lightness at the same time. This is not a joke about Norway. It is a precise description of how Norway operates. The oil fund is taken entirely seriously. The knighted penguin is taken entirely seriously. Neither requires the other to be diminished. A country that built its prosperity by listening carefully to what the ground beneath it was willing to give, that housed its seeds in frozen mountains as insurance against futures it hoped would never arrive. That placed its historical and contemporary buildings in the same visual conversation, without asking them to resolve their differences, that built a road across the open Atlantic, and accepted that the Atlantic would occasionally reclaim the surface of that road without apology. This country is not performing humility. It is expressing something older and less conscious than performance. The ice created the fjords. The fjords shaped the settlements. The settlements shaped the values. The values shaped everything that followed. What Norway offers is not a destination in the way that word is usually meant. It is a demonstration that the relationship between a society and its natural environment can be something other than dominance and extraction. That wealth, accumulated carefully and distributed through systems rather than concentrated in display, produces conditions for human life that money spent on visible monuments and private luxury does not produce. That a knighted penguin and a seed vault buried in Arctic permafrost are not curiosities at the edges of the same story, but its clearest illustrations. That the most powerful thing a civilization can do with its strength is to be very quiet about having it. The ice still moves, far beneath the fjords, at depths where instruments rather than eyes detect the pressure. The process that created Preikestolen and Nærøyfjord, and the valleys of Hardingerfjord, and the channels through which Norway's rivers have always run, is still operating on its own timeline, entirely indifferent to the settlements that occupy its results. The surface life of the country, its cities and its roads and its renewable energy installations, and its fishing villages and its seed vault, and its sovereign wealth fund, exists on top of geological time without fully acknowledging how thin that layer is, or how completely its character was determined by what lay beneath it. Norway does not look like what it is. That is, finally, the most Norwegian thing about it.